Empires do not collapse because they are weak. They collapse at the moment they believe they will never fall. History has shown us this over and over again. When the source of power in an empire breaks away from production, land, and people and turns into debt, collapse becomes inevitable. Let us think of the most powerful empires that have shaped the last 500 years. When we descend into their historical codes, a striking pattern appears. The Netherlands, Britain, Spain, the Ottomans. When we look at their rise and fall, we always see the same trajectory. So where exactly are we on this line right now? Today, to understand this pattern, we descend into the truths hidden within the codes of history. Welcome to Code 404, Economy, where the historical codes of money are revealed. The truth is always hidden in the details. Empires always begin in the same way. They grow through production and trade, expand through military power and control of resources. At the beginning, power is real. It is tangible. And most importantly, it is limited. Empires survive as long as they are aware of power and respect its limits. But there is no empire in history that has carried this discipline into the present day. A reserve currency is a currency that is predominantly accepted worldwide. Possessing a reserve currency is a key factor on the path to imperial dominance. When a new monetary system is established around a new currency, the world order is renewed as well. The most recent example of this occurred in 1944 with the Bretton Woods Agreement. With this agreement, the US dollar was accepted as the world's reserve currency and a new monetary system was established. This shift was not the only example in history. Similar transitions occurred before, and they were all manifestations of the same pattern. Let us take a closer look at the rise of empires. For a country to increase its wealth and power, it needs a perfectly functioning system. Sometimes this takes the form of properly managed spoils of conquest and war. At other times, it emerges through flawless production and trade networks. As a result, society becomes productive and the country becomes competitive in global trade. As countries take on a role in global trade routes grow in importance, and they must protect their interests from attacks. Thus, economic power transforms into great military power. When a country becomes the largest player in world trade, a critical threshold is crossed. It can now conduct transactions in its own currency. This allows the currency to spread globally. When a currency is widely accepted, trust in it increases, and people around the world want to hold their savings in that currency. And thus, that currency becomes the global reserve currency. Elevating an empire's currency to reserve status brings major advantages. Most importantly, the empire gains the ability to borrow almost without limit in its own currency. When people around the world use that currency to store their savings, they effectively lend it back to the empire. When the empire runs short of money, it also has the privilege of printing more than other countries. But alongside this extraordinary advantage comes serious disadvantages. Near limitless borrowing creates detachment from reality and lays the groundwork for financial bubbles. This chain has existed since the earliest days of history. Great powers that shape the world have always followed the same cycle, but the pits dug on the way to the summit also form the foundations of collapse. When empires climb the path and reach the peak, expansion eventually slows. As the country grows wealthier and people earn more, costs rise. The result of rising costs is a loss of competitiveness against other countries. At a certain point, the cost of maintaining power exceeds the cost of acquiring it. Armies become expensive. Bureaucracy slows down. Competitive strength declines. And at that moment, a crucial question emerges. How do we finance this power? The question is no longer how to gain more power. Debt enters the system permanently at this stage. Debt is no longer merely a tool. It becomes the central mechanism that must be continuously rolled over to sustain power. Having a globally accepted reserve currency inevitably brings excessive borrowing with it. While this creates an appearance of strength in the short term, in the long term it weakens the country's financial position, and the currency gradually loses strength. Borrowing fuels excessive consumption domestically, while financing international conflicts required to maintain the empire's global power. Thus, power is sustained beyond economic reality. Eventually, maintaining the empire costs more than it generates. At this point, the empire ceases to be profitable. The Dutch Empire is one of the clearest examples of this. To protect its global trade routes, it entered increasingly costly wars with rivals. Likewise, when the British Empire grew massive, it lost its competitive advantage in global trade as rivals rose. In this cycle, countries that appear rich and powerful eventually find themselves borrowing from poorer nations and facing enormous debt. Debt initially feels like a miracle. Armies are financed without new production. Projects are built without real growth. From the outside, the system still looks strong. For a while, it truly works. But debt always grows faster than real power. At a certain point, when the empire can no longer find new sources of borrowing, confidence in the currency erodes. People stop buying and holding it, and those who hold it begin to sell and exit. This is the breaking point, and the empire's power enters decline. The decline often appears sudden, but it advances slowly at first and then breaks abruptly at a single point. As a result, countries face two options. Either they must choose default, or they must print enormous amounts of new money. Throughout history, empires have always chosen to print money first. The outcome has always been the same. The currency rapidly loses value, and inflation explodes. Inflation destroys the purchasing power of fixed-income citizens and erodes savings. Living standards fall rapidly for most people. The gap between the rich and the poor widens. This creates a constant risk of internal conflict. In addition, large-scale money printing and rising inflation cause sharp declines in the currency's value. When the wealthy and investors believe their assets are at risk, they move their savings into other assets and currencies. Due to these capital outflows, the empire's tax revenues decline, and a process of internal hollowing begins. When capital flight reaches high levels, governments resort to restrictions. Panic follows. This chaotic environment reduces productivity, shrinks the economy, and turns the sharing of dwindling resources into a source of conflict. Internal chaos further weakens the empire. Meanwhile, rivals continue to grow. And when rising rivals see this chaos and weakness, they become bolder in challenging power. If a rival builds significant military strength, the risk of major conflict emerges. Defending the empire against internal chaos and external rivals is always expensive and requires massive military spending. These expenditures must be made precisely when the economy is deteriorating, accelerating the march toward the inevitable end. As all this unfolds, trust disappears within the empire. And when trust is lost, those holding the reserve currency and the empire's debt sell these assets. At this point, the cycle is complete. This is not a theory. It is a repeating pattern. So what is the situation in the modern world? Although the British Empire emerged victorious from World War II, it was financially exhausted. It had accumulated massive debt, much of it owed to the United States. This triggered money printing, devaluation, and a wave of selling in the pound. At the same time, the US dollar became the global reserve currency through the Bretton Woods Agreement. A new world order began, with the United States as the dominant power. Today, the United States holds record levels of debt. It spends more than it earns. It prints large amounts of money. Yet a major sell-off in the dollar and dollar-denominated debt has not yet begun. Where debt once belonged primarily to empires, today the debt mechanism is global. In the current global system for modern states, eliminating debt is not necessary. Debt must be rolled over. Financial markets today do not fear debt. On the contrary, they are dependent on it. So much so that if the United States decided to pay off all its debt, a global collapse would become inevitable. When debt becomes unmanageable, central banks intervene and postpone collapse. Today, the system stands not because it is strong, but because collapse can be continuously delayed. Since the 1990s, the United States has experienced 3 debt, financial boom and bust cycles, and each time the central bank intervened with increasingly aggressive measures. So where are we now, and where are we headed? Empires reach a peak, and decline inevitably follows. Once slowdown and decline begin, reversing them is difficult. What distinguishes the modern world from past eras is the scale of the collapse when the cycle completes. Today, the scale is not limited to a single empire. The entire world is connected through invisible financial networks, and debt has become global. What matters for us today is knowing what to do when that day comes. We must prepare in advance. Wealth tied solely to money is not real wealth. Therefore, educating ourselves and understanding what financial history teaches us is the most important thing. This is what separates us from others. Spending less than we earn and building savings will also prepare us for that day. History teaches a single lesson. Empires do not collapse because they borrow. They collapse when they forget why they borrowed. When debt replaces production and real power, collapse is no longer a choice. It becomes a schedule. And today, the modern world stands at the very center of that schedule. If this video gave you a new perspective, subscribe. The answers are hidden in history's codes. We reveal them.